सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
In the very beginning of this episode of Cut The Clutter, which is on complex strategic issues involving India, China, Bhutan, the LAC, our border dispute with China, Arunachal Pradesh, and the Americans at strategic levels. In the beginning of this episode, let me introduce a term to you. Now, I know most of you are Gyanis and you know this term, but the context is very specific now. And also, this is not something that we've used so far in our CTC debate or discussions. That is lawfare. Lawfare, what is lawfare? So lawfare, the exact definition of lawfare is when one side uses legal systems and institutions to damage or to delegitimize an opponent or to deter an individual's usage of their legal rights. So in terms of two nations, how does it work? Say in terms of border conflict. That is, these borders are settled. One day I start saying, oh, actually, I think the border is there. So I move a couple of kilometers into the other one's territory. The other one will then say, no, that is not the border. The border is as established and as I believe it. Then you again make that claim and again and again and again, and then at multiple points you make those claims. So in the course of time, this becomes a dispute. So what was settled then begins to look like a dispute. Then you say, all right, I'm quite happy to settle. I'm very reasonable, right? Call in anybody, you can call in a mediator, or you and I can sit together. So थोड़ा बहुत ले दे के फैसला कर लेंगे. With a little bit of give and take, we'll settle this. So basically, you've used lawfare. That is lawfare. I'm simplifying it. Maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but that is lawfare. And that is the term that our columnist on China, he's a very young China domain specialist, Adil Brar, right now. He's on an academic fellowship in Taiwan. He has written in his article that China is now using lawfare with India over Arunachal Pradesh and Bhutan. Effectively, it affects India in both places because they're trying to change their status quo on the border vis-a-vis Bhutan. So they're putting pressure on Bhutan. They're making multiple claims in Bhutan repetitively. And now they've once again buttressed their claims in Arunachal Pradesh. So just as India has been dealing with kind of a new kerfuffle out of Bhutan after the interview of their prime minister to a Belgian newspaper, although the Bhutanese government after that has tried to do damage control by saying that he was misunderstood and misread in India. But the very fact that immediately after that interview came out, the Bhutanese king came to India and both sides reassured each other, that tells you that that wasn't just a case of an interview being misread. In the Chinese media, on the other hand, Chinese media is all official media, so anything that comes out, you have to presume that either has the government sanction or that is the government speaking. So if you look at the Chinese media, Adil Brar tells us, and please read his article, tells us that this is a setback for India and this is a victory for China. Setback for India for the simple reason that Doklam, for the Bhutanese to say that China also is a party to the dispute in Doklam or to the issue in Doklam is seen as a victory for China, that India has not been able to prevent Bhutan from saying so, or that India has not been able to control Bhutan, complicates the situation further for India. So it's a defeat for India or a setback for India. There's been a flurry of commentaries in Chinese official media again and again calling India a bully vis-a-vis Bhutan, calling India a hegemon vis-a-vis Bhutan, so on and so forth. So there's a pattern to this. So that is Bhutan. And while India has been dealing with this crisis vis-a-vis Bhutan, this is no coincidence. The Chinese have suddenly once again announced the places of the so-called quote-unquote Chinese names of 11 places in Arunachal Pradesh. And with that, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson has said that the so-called Arunachal Pradesh actually is South Tibet, which is what they always say. They've been saying, in fact, since 2006. And there is some significance to that we'll talk about. By 2006, that she said that Zangnan is what they call Arunachal Pradesh, Zangnan or South Tibet. That is their territory. That is their sovereign territory. They can name any place as they so wish. Now, Adil Brar also tells us that most of these names actually are direct transliterations of Tibetan names of these places. So that's where we stand. Chinese have unleashed full-fledged lawfare in the eastern sector now. In the western sector, we have almost a live line of actual control with frontline troops piled up on both sides, although now with the creation of the buffer zones, the areas of friction, areas of day-to-day friction have been lessened a great deal, barring two, that is Depsang Plains and in the Demchok area. But besides that, the Chinese now have opened up an entire new sector on the Eastern Front. Remember, Eastern Front, it is where on December 9 last year, Chinese troops had come and had tried to dislodge the Indian troops staying there, but Indian troops were alerted. There are some reports that the alerts came from American satellite data, but we can't confirm it. Nevertheless, Indian troops were alert and gave the Chinese an effective pushback. So Chinese went back, and that was a bit of a tactical setback on the ground for the Chinese. So maybe the Chinese were also smarting under that. And that's how these multiple developments have come. The pressure, increased pressure on Bhutan. First, the border talks with Bhutan. Then this Bhutanese Prime Minister's interview. Then this commentary in Chinese official media or propaganda media. And a lot of this commentary is being written by scholars of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Chinese Academy of Social Sciences reports directly to the Chinese Communist Party State Council, which is the premier policy-making body. So it is also to be presumed, and that's what Adil Brar is also saying, it's also to be presumed, and I see this in commentary elsewhere, it is to be presumed that this renaming of these 11 places in Arunachal Pradesh, it's the third time the Chinese have done it since 2017, 2021, and now 2023. This was perhaps done on a nudge by the scholars or so-called scholars of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Now, in the middle of all this, something else very important has happened. Very important and very interesting. So, a very influential paper has come up from an American think tank, a conservative strategic affairs think tank called CNAS, which is CNAS is short form for Center for New American Security. I will share a link with you. You can read the entire paper. Very easy to read with nice graphics, written by Lisa Curtis and Derek Grossman. Now, Lisa Curtis and Derek Grossman have both had wide, deep, and long experience dealing with issues of South Asia and Indo-Pacific. Not just in the academia. They were in the academia. In fact, Lisa Curtis used to be with the Heritage Foundation between 2006 and 2017 when she joined the Trump administration. But she's worked since then at the CIA, at the National Security Council, and also at the US embassies in New Delhi and Islamabad. So she's somebody who's focused on the region for a very long time. Under Trump administration, she served as Senior Director for South and Central Asia at the National Security Council. Currently, she's Senior Fellow and Director for Indo-Pacific Security Program at CNAS, the think tank. Derek Grossman is also a Senior Defense Analyst. He's a Senior Defense Analyst right now at RAND Corporation. Again, on the conservative side, he's widely quoted in global journals, global publications as an authority. He was the daily intelligence briefer to Director Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington. He's worked at NSA and CIA and is currently also adjunct professor at University of Southern California. In fact, if you see this report and you see the cover picture of the report, see the picture. One of the pictures there, you can see the picture is basically the India-China LAC locales, but the picture also of the standoff at Galwan River Valley. That's where Indian and Chinese troops are screaming at each other. You can see that picture there. So that sets the context quite effectively. So the report says that the US has to worry about the fact that while something happened in Galwan in 3 years ago, but the fact is that now the area of conflict or area of friction has enlarged, and now you cannot count out any part of the 2100 mile India-China border or line of actual control. 2100 miles is like 3,400 kilometers or approximately that much. They also say that until now, the US view on security in the region was focused on the India-Pakistan equation. So while it has begun to shift from India-Pakistan to India-China, probably the shift has to be much sharper and much faster. In fact, they recommend that the shift has to be much more decisive and much clearer. And they also say that India obviously most certainly does not want direct US involvement in any conflict with China, but it's their understanding that India is confident that it will get support from the US if requested. So you have to read all of this together. The Chinese arriving in Arunachal Pradesh, therefore lighting up a border that had been dormant for a long time. 3 years back, they lit up the western sector in Ladakh. Now they have served notice on India in the eastern sector as well. As if that was not enough, they have now lit yet another fire vis-a-vis Bhutan. So they are making India now focus on both sides, western side and the eastern side. So the idea is to stretch India. So even the writers of this paper are provoked by what is going on. Maybe if it had remained confined only to the western sector, then this kind of assessment would not have come from Lisa Curtis and Derek Hoffman, who've been there, done that. They are not people who are easily provoked into taking these positions. Now, the authors quote the Biden administration's October 2022 National Defense Strategy. In that, they've taken out a quote. In that, they say that Biden administration goes on to say that they will support allies and partners facing, and this is a quote from the report, and I quote, partners facing acute forms of grey zone coercion. What is grey zone? Ye tera, ye mera. Is this territory yours? Is this territory mine? Right? Is this part of the sea is yours? Is this part of the sea is mine? Is this your EZ? Is this my EZ? Things like that. That's grey zone. So America then vows to support all allies and friends who are facing, quote, acute forms of grey zone coercion from the PRC's, People Republic of China's campaign to establish control over East China Seas, South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, and disputed land borders as with India. So India was mentioned in that national defense strategy. The authors say that this signaled US support for New Delhi in a potential fresh border crisis in case it is forthcoming, in case it happens. Now, they say that to contain China, America needs to now find more resources, and it has to keep more resources ready to contain China vis-a-vis India, to answer India's concerns. And therefore, they say US has to do two things. One, to take the policy measures to prevent such a crisis from coming up again. And second, to be prepared to help India in case such a crisis arises, because you cannot now rule out that such a thing will not happen. And then there is a bunch of recommendations. So number one, elevate India's territorial disputes with China on par with others in the region. So what this means is this should reflect in all American documents on the region, all American security related documents on the region, and speeches as well. Number two, offer India sophisticated military technology, initiate co-production and co-development. Again, very strong recommendation, because one reaction can be that this is just an academic paper by people who are no longer in the government. But that's not how Washington works. The way Washington works is that many think tanks work, they produce this kind of literature, and then it depends on how influential who is, because the US Congress, foreign policy, US administration, US thinking classes, all of them are influenced by this. Third point, assist India to enhance its maritime and naval capacity. Fourth, set up, and this is important because both of these are former intelligence officials at a high level dealing with our region. So the fourth point is set up joint intelligence reviews between the American and the Indian side to make assessments of Chinese plans and intentions along the LAC and enhance coordination in case things go wrong tomorrow. The fifth point, again a very interesting one, strengthen official and unofficial platforms in both countries to get more access to unclassified commercial satellite imagery and to then publicize it, to bring it in the larger debate. And what is this imagery about? This imagery should be about Chinese troop movements in Tibet, in areas which are relevant to India or which are adjacent to the line of actual control, so that more people do what they are doing. Number 6, they say that the US administration, Biden administration, should more proactively criticize Beijing for its land grabbing, salami slicing, and this criticism should go to all multilateral forums, including the UN Shangri-La Dialogue that the International Institute for Strategic Studies holds in Singapore every year, UN Shangri-La Dialogue, G20 forums, and the East Asia Summit. Number 7, again important, lean on Pakistan, give a message to Pakistan directly and through other Western allies also, that in case there is a conflict between India and China, or in case things worsen between India and China, Pakistan must stay neutral. Number 8, be prepared to extend full support to India in case of a conflict. How important is the India-China border issue to the larger Indo-Pacific question from the American point of view? Sitting in Washington, the authors say that the India-China border conflict is the defining characteristic of the Indo-Pacific security environment. So this is central to what's happening in the Indo-Pacific security environment. It's not just something happening on the side. And what the Chinese have done, they say, the Chinese have pushed India into many dilemmas. I told you that one dilemma the Chinese have pushed India into is whether to look west or to look east, because right now, until 3-4 months back, we might have thought that, oh, the action is confined to the west. That is the Ladakh sector. That's why 50,000 Indian troops were moved there. About 25,000 were thinned out from line of control on the Pakistan side. In fact, those troop movements also this paper takes note of. But now you have to think about the east as well. So that is a dilemma for India. But at the same time, the authors say the Chinese have created one more dilemma for India. That is to figure out whether to put more resources, more money into strengthening their defenses on land or in the water. So is this going to take Indian resources away from building its maritime power, which might just be the objective or one of the objectives that the Chinese have? The authors also say that in the process, all agreements that India signed, that beginning with the 1993 agreement that was signed when Narasimha Rao was Prime Minister, that was the agreement on peace and tranquility along the LAC. That was strengthened in 1996 by the confidence building measures in military field, that's the name of the agreement, which actually put force restrictions on both sides. And it laid down that at any point of time, no side should have more than 15,000 troops in close vicinity of the LAC. Right now, all of these agreements have gone out of the window. In fact, if anything, on the Ladakh side alone, both India and China have about 50,000. That's more than 3,000 of the total troops they were supposed to have on the entire 3,400 kilometer LAC according to these earlier agreements. Also, these earlier agreements, particularly in 1996, strengthened later, say in 2003, all these have gone out of the window because these agreements also, the 1996 agreement in particular, laid down that both sides will also now take certain heavy weaponry, long-range artillery, air defense systems, missiles, etc. close to the LAC. Now, all of that restraint is gone. Anything that the two countries have, their most deadly elements in their arsenal are now arrayed along the LAC. In fact, the report also notices that the Chinese have also brought in their S-400 missiles, Russian S-400 missiles, which India is also buying. And the Chinese have also brought in their HK-6 long-range bombers to airfields in Tibet. And that has really escalated the issue vis-a-vis India. Now, there's an interesting point that the report makes. The report says that the expression or description South Tibet, that emerged from the Chinese side in 2006. Now, 2006 is when Dr. Manmohan Singh's government really started warming up to the Americans, and that is when the nuclear deal, just after that, the nuclear deal, the initial talks, and the evolution of the nuclear deal took place. So there is a suggestion that the Chinese responded like this, suddenly rustling up the idea of Arunachal Pradesh being South Tibet and expanding their territorial claims on India. That was to limit India's strategic options or strategic sovereignty. The report says that India probably responded to it and the Chinese succeeded because 2007, the Malabar exercise that India, US, etc. take place, that was curtailed. I know there were internal issues also because A.K. Antony, who was then defense minister, he wasn't a pacifist, but he was just an old-timer. In my view, I mean, he's in news today, his son has joined the BJP, but in my view, he's been India's longest serving defense minister, but in my view, he did not particularly distinguish himself in the job. He looked at everything with a narrow focus, and his worry about exercise Malabar, etc. also was that somehow Muslim voters in Kerala will be unhappy, if at all, with the name of that exercise, because Malabar means Kerala coast. So the exercise was curtailed. This paper thinks that this was also under the influence of the Chinese pushback. So Chinese again used a kind of lawfare at that point by suddenly wrestling up South Tibet for Arunachal Pradesh to force India to curtail its strategic autonomy. They also point out that this led to a slowdown of sorts in India on whether India should be equidistant, and also resulted in the publication of a paper. This is a paper published in 2012 by Center for Policy Research in Delhi, paper by a bunch of very distinguished authors led by Sunil Khilnani, academic Sunil Khilnani, titled Non-Alignment 2.0, strongly recommending to India that India should go back to some kind of an equidistance. The underlying message was that if you get too close to the Americans, Chinese will get upset, and maybe that is not such a good idea. Now, a very important question will arise. It's one thing for top US strategic academics to recommend this course of action. Be prepared to help India in case a conflict arises. Be prepared to help India in the build-up to the conflict, so on and so forth. But does India want the US help? Because India also balances many things at the same time. So they do acknowledge this question, and they say, look, we believe that the Indian view is do something, but not too much. But at the same time, they also underline and reveal what's been known in informed circles in New Delhi, but has not been talked too much about Indian media and Indian public debate. That is the help that the Americans gave India during the Ladakh crisis. For example, the two MQ-9 drones for surveillance to pick up pictures from a distance. But we also know that the Americans also dipped into their own emergency reserves to provide India equipment and clothing to kit out about 15,000 troops for extreme winter weather in Ladakh. And that was of great help because it did come out after the Galwan clash that the Chinese soldiers who had come to fight there did come prepared, and they were wearing body-hugging rubber clothing, like scuba kind of clothing, inside, under their uniform. So even if they fell in the river, they were protected from the effects of the extreme cold there, which Indian soldiers were not. So a lot of that equipment had come from America in a hurry. So India, they reckon, in any such situation, will have the view, do something, but not too much. Quite significantly, this report was released formally by Senator Jeff Merkley, and he's the same India-friendly senator who moved a resolution on the Hill in February, a couple of months back, proclaiming that all of Arunachal Pradesh was a part of India, and that McMahon Line was the legitimate border between India and China. Again, this report has always had some kind of an approval from the Biden administration. So Kurt Campbell, who's the Biden administration's coordinator for the Indo-Pacific, he has said good things about the report, and he's also called some parts of the report actionable. So read the sequence of events. December 9 last year, the Chinese come into Arunachal Pradesh. January, just a couple of weeks later, the Chinese and the Bhutanese have their border talks. Then the Bhutanese Prime Minister's statement. Then the Bhutanese king's visit to India just after that statement caused some discomfort in India. Then in the middle, the US Senate resolution proclaiming all of Arunachal as a part of India. And just after that, the Chinese increased Chinese pressure on Bhutan through commentary in their own media. And then this renaming of 11 places in Arunachal Pradesh. And then finally, this very influential paper, which has come from the conservative side, but seems to have quite a wide acceptance from Biden administration as well.